Hello, I'm Jonasz Lewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. Russia's ruling class was expected to be the one group capable of restraining Vladimir Putin. They were the technocrats, the managers, the administrators who kept the state functioning, who understood the economic risks, and who had the most to lose from a catastrophic war. And yet, when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, they did not resist. They did not push back. That is why, on this episode, we look at why and what this reveals about how modern Russia truly works. Because beneath the surface of Russia's wartime resilience lies something more fragile, a ruling class caught between fear, loyalty, habit, and self-preservation. A class that has, over 2 decades, surrendered the qualities that define elites in functioning states: autonomy, vision, and the capacity to influence the future. Without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
For most of its history, Russia has been a state run by some sort of despot living in the Kremlin or in St. Petersburg. The country's modern political system is transforming to fit its historical image. A term has been coined to describe this change, while Putinism. Essentially, it means that the country's politics are shifting away from institutional rule and being replaced by pure ideology, with none other than Vladimir Putin himself being at its center. But where usually authoritarianism is characterized by a certain kind of distorted stability and cult of personality, this world Putinism is just that, unpredictable. This shift has been ongoing since Putin became president at the turn of the century, but it didn't really come into its own until the war in Ukraine. Elite factions still exist in Russia's political theater, but they do not threaten Putin's grip on power. Instead, they defer to him and his authority. Russian politics have therefore become violent, and those who threaten this world state of affairs are usually removed. Such an unpredictable environment, however, has also been cause for paranoia among the Russian ruling class.
I think the more blood spilled, the more blood will be spilled. And so I think, unfortunately, it's sort of the vicious circle of KGB/Stalin/dictatorial totalitarian power. So that's my view, is that because one of the reasons that critics are being eliminated is because the Kremlin is paranoid, Putin is paranoid.
This new political system has also spilled over beyond domestic policy. As Putin subordinates increasingly more of Russia's apparatus under the presidential office, traditional avenues of policymaking like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are being sidelined, with Putin or one of his cronies taking over the role of conducting foreign policy as well. At this point, decisions about Russia's diplomacy and domestic affairs both are being done through interpersonal meetings controlled by Putin himself, rather than through Russia's state apparatus.
And now we're zoning in on the East-splaining portion of our show. At a quick glance, it seems that the Russian population is fully on board with the invasion of Ukraine. Yet it turns out that Russia's public opinion may be more divided on the matter, as the silence of the anti-war opposition does not equal consensus.
Recent research suggests that Russians are far more divided on how they view the war in Ukraine than it often appears in public. When looking at how they talk about the war in everyday situations like chatting on public transport or at public events, observers have found that the war's supporters are far more likely to share their views. On the other hand, people who oppose the war are far more likely to stay quiet, especially in public, as speaking such opinions can carry risks of fines or even jail. Behind closed doors, however, the picture is much different. Reportedly, around 4 in 10 Russians claim that pro-war opinions are not really that common among their closest family and friends, far more than state television or street interviews would have one believe. What's more, there also has been uncertainty surrounding the decision-making at the very top. Many Russians do believe that the Kremlin fully supports the war, but there is a non-insignificant number of Russians who think that the political elite is also divided on the matter. This gap between what is openly being said in Russia's public areas and what Russians believe in private has created an impression of far stronger support for the war than may actually exist. It may very well be that Russia is a society where opinions on the war remain divided, but are often carefully managed in daily conversations.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Why didn't Russia's ruling class turn against Vladimir Putin after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a war many of them believed to be disastrous, irrational, and directly harmful to their own interests? To answer this question, we must look at how that ruling class evolved over the last 25 years, and how its members gradually lost the autonomy that would have allowed them to rebel. Russia's civilian bureaucracy, the ministries, agencies and state-linked corporations that form what might be called the administrative elite, is not a monolithic structure. It consists of several layers: long-term acquaintances from St. Petersburg period, holdovers from the 1990s market reforms, younger technocrats who built their careers under Putin, and managers recruited from major corporations in the 2010s. Now, many of these people entered public service sincerely believing they could play a constructive role in shaping Russia's path. They assumed that even in an authoritarian environment, rational decision-making had some space. But the deeper they went into the system, the more they encountered informal practices, loyalty-based selection, and the gradual elimination of institutional autonomy. Over time, the ruling class stopped functioning as an elite in any classical sense. An elite develops ideas, articulates values, and helps craft a vision for the future. Russia's administrative class did not do any of this. Instead, it became a collection of managers, executors rather than originators, tasked with implementing decisions made elsewhere. Policy was not something they shaped, it was something they reacted to. Their main responsibility became mitigating the consequences of decisions over which they had no influence. This dependence intensified through repeated crises. Whether we're talking about the global financial crisis, the pandemic, or the geopolitical shocks triggered by Russia's aggression since 2014, the ruling class increasingly acted as crisis managers. Their role was to stabilize, not to suggest any alternatives. And so the system produced administrators skilled at managing chaos, but incapable of preventing it. Membership in the ruling class comes with a sense of belonging to an exclusive circle bound by a shared secret, the truth of how the system really works. Losing that membership means falling out of a world where power, however limited, still exists. Sanctions added another layer of pressure to all this. Many officials felt personally targeted by the West, and while they believed sanctions would not stop the war, they resented their impact on their lives. Now, paradoxically, this resentment reinforced their dependence on the system. They could no longer live easily in the West. Their assets were frozen, their mobility limited. For many, turning against the regime was simply not an option. Even daily behavior reflected this atmosphere of control. Some officials became paranoid about surveillance, destroying phones or conducting conversations in forests to avoid potential eavesdropping. Others compartmentalized their own private doubts, abruptly cutting off discussions if they felt watched. The specter of physical danger was real. The fate of dismissed officials, from prosecutions to mysterious deaths, served as constant reminders of their vulnerability. In such an environment, loyalty was less a political choice than a survival mechanism. The ruling class did not resist the war because it could not. It had already surrendered the tools required to do so. And in that surrender lies the greatest uncertainty about Russia's political future. And now here to shed more light on the issue is David DeBado, geopolitical analyst, retired US Army counterintelligence officer. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me again.
So, from your professional experience, how easy is it to gauge the overall mood and sentiment within a country such as Russia, which is partially opaque, and when you're looking at the country's elites, what the current attitude is? Sometimes we might actually use certain mental shorthands, like try to use historical analogies. But if you want a real picture, is it actually possible to produce one, given how isolated to some extent Russia has become?
It's a great question, and the answer is it's very difficult. We, the West, don't have as many sources as we used to. As you just said, it's a very closed society, becoming closer to, say, a North Korea than anywhere else. The elites, as you said, the oligarchs and those that are in leading positions in the country, both civilian and government, are very hesitant to talk to anyone, even inside Russia, about their true feelings about what's going on right now, about the government, about their personal or professional lives. So the best that we can do, and the best that Western intelligence has been doing is, like you just said, looking at historical precedents. Of course, there are dissenters, there are people who have left Russia and give their opinions, but of course, it's not current. It depends on how long ago they left. And based on all of that, intelligence is putting together a picture of what's going on inside of Russia. Of course, Ukraine is helping a great deal by their intercepts, their telephone and radio and social media intercepts, which are giving a very good and I believe accurate picture of what's going on inside, not just Russia itself, but inside the Kremlin.
So what would you say is a chance that the elites might, if not rebel against the Kremlin openly, then at least push for a peaceful resolution of the war? There have been suggestions that at least some groups within the Russian elites are not entirely satisfied with the way things are at the moment.
I think the chances of any kind of a serious push against the Kremlin by the elites, the oligarchs, the richest people in the country who occupy positions of power, both within the government and within private civilian organizations, is remote. They traditionally have not been the ones, along with the Russian people, who have made great changes within the Russian power structure. If and when a change comes, if there is a pushback, or in fact some kind of a coup, if you will, against the current Kremlin leadership, it's going to come from the Civilaki, the security services, both the army and the security services, the FSB and SVO and so forth. And there among the security services, specifically the military right now, is where you're starting to see some significant cracks. And I think that, if anywhere, is where the change is going to come from. Look, the Russian army, the military in general, is very, very unhappy with the way things are going in Ukraine. As your viewers probably know, a Russian general was just assassinated, the third one within a year, in Moscow, where his car was blown up. That's a minor side note. The fact is, the Russian military is doing very badly in Ukraine, despite the nonsensical propaganda coming out of the Kremlin. And there is starting to be a pushback, some significant cracks against the party line in the Kremlin by the Russian military. And that's something that we are keeping an eye on.
But that is a fascinating point. Some analysts are suggesting that it is, in fact, the more business-oriented members of the elite who might be hoping for a resolution here, because they do not stand to benefit from the current situation. But the fact that you're actually shifting the attention to the military could be quite relevant here, because this is a totally different angle, and arguably, these people are closer to the center of events there. So what would you say would be the possible breaking point there, and what would they want to achieve? Would they hope for the war to simply peter out? Or for some sort of deal to be made in order for the military to rebuild its capabilities? Or do their grievances actually run deeper than that, against the very way the country is being governed? Where would you say, at the moment, do things stand within the Russian military?
Well, right now, the Russian military is conflicted. I mean, like any military of a large country, there's two different camps. One is a very conservative, if you will, warrior type of group, where they want to pursue the war in Ukraine even more strongly. They want more support. They want more power. They want more ammunition, more drones, more people to pursue the war. They think it should have been pursued from the very, very beginning. They're very unhappy with the strategy and the tactics being used in Ukraine. There's another camp within the military who is just disgusted. They're tired. They're tired of losing their own people. They're tired of the way that the war has been pursued. They're tired of and disgusted at what it's doing to the reputation of the Russian military. And despite, again, what the Kremlin says, the reputation of the Russian military is in tatters. It came in as arguably the second best military in the world. And as the saying goes, it's now the second best military in Ukraine. So they are very, very unhappy. And that second group, I believe, if they get their way, if there is some kind of a makeover, a change within the Kremlin, would I believe call a halt to the war. At the very least, they would try to get out of it with as much dignity as they can through negotiations. However, if the first camp wins, then that's a whole other story. You're going to see the hardliners, if Putin is replaced, pursue the war even harder, which could mean conscription, which has its own drawbacks, of course, and dangers. Within Russia, you can see the war economy ramped up even more, and just a more dangerous situation for Europe and the world overall.
Would you say that if there are any opponents of the war within the military, and if they choose to act, could they try to find allies within other groups, other parts of the Russian elite, perhaps the oligarchs or the business community, people who are like-minded in that Russia, as you've mentioned, is losing its reputation. It is also losing its global position, losing its opportunities for engagement with other countries in a peaceful way. Could they perhaps form any sort of, at least temporary, alliance to influence the authorities? We're, of course, talking about this sort of more likely scenario of a gradual process. Of course, one cannot entirely, rule out the situation whereby the authorities would be toppled. But then again, I mean, it happened in Russia in the past. But then again, it used to be a wishful thinking. At the very start of the war, people were saying, okay, Putin is going to be overthrown any time now, any day now. It never happened, right? But even assuming that it's going to be an evolution, could this happen through an alliance of different forces?
Well, sure. And I think that that's probably already being initiated at some levels. The Russian military, as I said, is going to have to be the primary leader, the motivator, the force within any kind of a major change. We're talking a power shift, regime change within Russia. But yes, they would have to reach out to the civilian leaders, the oligarchs, the people that run all the corporations in Russia that the military depends on. And I am certain that those feelers, those types of conversations have already taken place at kind of what if, and connections are being made so that if the military actually does take a major move towards regime change, that they would work in concert, in coordination with the oligarchs, the elite, to coordinate the logistics of what would have to happen in a post-Putin Russia. And let me just make a point here, if I can. As you said, people have been saying for years that the end of Putin is just around the corner, that the Kremlin is about to implode, that the oligarchs have just had enough, and the FSB has had enough, and on and on and on. We're not really close to that right now. I don't want to give people the wrong impression, but as I said, there are some cracks in the military that we have not seen before, and that is definitely something we all need to keep an eye on.
Now, in a hypothetical situation whereby Russia tries its military adventurism elsewhere, be it Moldova or even some sort of large-scale hybrid or even conventional operation against, say, one of the Baltic states, could this bring the rifts that you've mentioned even closer to a breaking point, given that consequences for Russia could potentially be even more dire than we have today?
Well, certainly, and that's a great point. There are those within the leadership of the Russian military who already believe that they are overstretched, that they were not prepared to go into Ukraine in the way that they have, and that they certainly don't believe they are prepared to make any kind of a strike, an advance, or aggression against any NATO countries. And let me just say, the Baltic countries, as small as they may be, are the most prepared right now in NATO for Russian aggression. So to answer your question, if the Kremlin, Putin, decided that he wanted to make a move within, say, the next year against any part, say the eastern flank of NATO, yes, there would, I believe, be some pretty strong pushback within the Russian military. Would that lead to a coup? That's arguable. I don't know, because, again, we don't have enough inside information right now, but it would certainly exacerbate that camp within the Russian military, the hierarchy, the generals who feel that they're going in the wrong direction already. Would that explode then into some concrete action against regime change? I think it would be a very interesting development, and if it happens, we'd have to wait and see.
David Badu was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.